The X-600M is a powerful, web-enabled programmable logic controller. It can be expanded to monitor and control over 1,000 I/O points by adding ControlByWeb I/O modules and one-wire sensors. This video explains two different options for connecting ControlByWeb I/O modules to the X-600M controller. The first type of I/O modules are a series of slave expansion modules, such as the X11S, X12S, and so on. These directly connect to the X600M through a ribbon cable, which we refer to as the expansion bus. The expansion bus powers the modules and provides differential serial communications between the modules and the X600M. We offer a variety of expansion modules that include relays, digital inputs, thermocouples, analog inputs, and more. The expansion modules are easy to use because they don't require a separate power supply, Ethernet connection, or IP address. The second type of I/O modules, which can be used with the X600M, are all of our existing standalone Ethernet modules that we have offered for many years. Although these modules can be used as standalone devices, they can also be used as slave devices to the X600M. These modules also include relays, analog inputs, digital inputs, and more. The advantage of these devices is that they don't have to be physically located next to the X600M. They can be located anywhere on the local network or even anywhere on the internet, as long as you properly configure access to your network routers. In most cases, to configure ControlByWeb I/O modules to work with the X600M, you will add the modules under the Devices tab in the X600M setup pages by clicking on the Find New Devices button, which will automatically scan for devices located on the expansion bus or on your local network. Once you give the device a name and description, click Add. You can then fill out any additional information for the device's I/O. Once the devices are added, you will add their inputs and outputs that you are interested in by clicking on the I/O tab, then selecting the type of I/O you want. After clicking Edit, fill in the relevant information about the I/O. This is the only way to add inputs and outputs from expansion modules, and it is the only way to add outputs, such as relays, from standalone devices over the Ethernet network. Inputs from standalone devices can be configured in two different ways. First, on the X600M, you can configure the input by adding the device and then the I/O the same way that you would set up an output. In most cases, this works great and is easy to set up, and the configuration is clearly documented in the X600M setup pages. The disadvantage of this approach is that an input could change and the X600M might not know about it for a few seconds. This is because the X600M updates the input status of each device by periodically polling all of the devices that are set up. Typically, this is done every few seconds. In many cases, a few second delay on the input will not make any difference. However, for some applications, the X600M must know immediately when the input changes because it must quickly act upon that input change. For example, a light switch connected to an input should immediately turn the lights on, rather than waiting a few seconds. To avoid this delay, you can configure the ControlByWeb standalone devices to immediately send input status updates to the X600M whenever an input changes. This second option is done by setting up registers on the X600M and then configuring the standalone devices to change the status of those registers whenever an input changes. Once the registers are created, you would configure the X600M to perform a function whenever those registers change. To set up a register on the X600M, click on the I/O tab. From there, you can click on Registers and then click on Add New Register on the right side of the window. A small pop-up window appears where you can enter the register's information. The register name must be the word register followed by a numeric value. This is because commands from other standalone devices only send register values to those types of names. For this example, we will type the name register1 and give it a description. You can also select the type as well as fill out other information about the register. Once you are done, click Add. After you create the register, you can configure a conditional event to occur whenever that register changes. You would then configure an action to do something based on that conditional event. Once finished, click Commit Changes. The final step is to configure the standalone device's input to change a register in the X600M. For example, if you want the X310's input 1 to change register 1 on the X600M, you would do the following. Open the X310 setup pages by typing in its IP address followed by /setup.html. Click on I/O Setup and then Remote I/O tab. Specify the IP address, TCP port, and password of the X600M. Select I/O type, register, and specify I/O1. This means we want to change register 1. Below that, set up the control source to digital input 1 because that's the input that will trigger the event in the X600M. Select Remote I/O Action, I/O equals source. This means, for this example, when the X310's input 1 turns on, register 1 on the X600M will be set to 1, and when input 1 turns off, register 1 will be set to 0. After you have made those changes, click Submit. You can now test the setup and make sure everything works properly. If it doesn't work, carefully check the settings and network configuration. For troubleshooting tips, please see our support page at www.controlbyweb.com/support.html.